A year and a half ago, I was sitting in my school bus turned tiny home, looking out over the beautiful blue water of the lake I was parked beside, and I thought to myself, it's not enough. I need to be able to open my front door and step directly into the water. So I sold the bus, moved into a house, and I've spent the last couple months cutting out endless pieces of plywood, learning to use new tools, creating stacks and stacks of pieces in the hopes that eventually I will have this. My own floating tiny home. And today, in the middle of a snowstorm, I'm finally gonna take this pile of wood cluttering up my garage and turn it into something that I can at least imagine being a boat someday. I ended my last video with a promise that in the time before the next episode began, I would be hard at work behind the scenes assembling the rest of the pieces of the hull so that today, maybe we can all finally see some actual satisfying progress on this houseboat build already. Pretty lousy timing for moving this operation outside. True to my word, I got her done and steadily worked my way to having enough cut, screwed, and glued components, not only to start assembling a hull, but to fill up my entire garage to the point I can no longer work in here. So now's the time, I thought. We're finally ready to take this build outside. And then I woke up to this. But you know what they say, if you want to spend the summer cruising around lakes in your cute as heck tiny floating home, you better be willing to spend your winter building in a few feet of snow. So I got to work, starting with cleaning up splooshed out epoxy from my framed bulkheads. The full-length bulkheads also needed some finishing touches before they were ready for assembly. These will go side to side and are designed to slide together with the pieces that run front to back, so they need a slot the same width as the thickness of the plywood. I pulled out my favorite new tool, the router, and immediately forgot how it works. I started off strong with this little blemish that had me kicking myself until about 4 minutes later, when I would make a way bigger mistake and forget all about this one. This router bit was a little bit different than the one I've been using and wouldn't cut all the way through the plywood, so I decided to make 2 passes because that was the first and easiest solution that came to mind. Once the slots were slotting, I also cut out these little notches for the 2x2 framing to rest in. I had the guide taped down with double-sided tape, and I was afraid I was going to push too hard, pop the guide out of place, and ruin everything. So naturally, I overcorrected and let the router just wander in the other direction to its heart's content, and ruined everything. Ah! Oh no! Again, I decided to remedy my mistake with the first solution that popped into my head, whipping up a batch of epoxy, filling in the crevice, and hoping that it would be fine. I needed to do the same thing on the stern bulkhead, but this time I nailed the guide into place instead of using tape because F it, having a tiny nail hole is way better than having a crusty wiggly slot that's in the wrong place altogether. With the stern bulkhead finished, it was becoming abundantly clear that the sooner I could get some of these pieces out of here, the better.
It's getting pretty hard to work in here. Oh no. Ah, shoot. Oh my gosh.
But with one half of my bulkheads filled with uncured goo, there was nothing I could do but call it a night and head inside to wait out the storm rolling in. The next morning, after waking myself up with some snow shoveling, I got back to it.
The dam is breaking in. It was bound to happen, 'cause your heart is caving in.
When I cut out the bow bulkhead originally, I cut an angle into the bottom. Before I could start assembling the hull, I needed to cut a matching angle in the edges of my freshly cut notches. The instructions say to do this with a chisel, but I don't have the first clue how to cut a precise angle with a chisel, so I decided to use my jigsaw. It doesn't have one of those number things that shows you what angle it's set at, so I just sort of set it up against the angle I was trying to match and tightened it there, hoping, as usual, that that would be fine. With that, it was finally time to start assembling the hull. After all these weeks of making cut after cut, learning new tools, piling my creations around the garage until I couldn't move, all without really seeing anything happen, it's all about to pay off. I started to set up some sawhorses in the snow and was trying to level them with a 2x4. Don't ask me why I was doing it this way, I don't know.
And the moment we're off it, we try so hard to stop it. I hope we make it.
I propped up some of the legs with some blocks and then realized that was stupid because I was on dirt, so I broke the snow shovel back out and cleared a spot.
You've been running again. Before you know it, it's all over. So enjoy your heartbreak. Enjoy your heartbreak, my friend.
This was followed by a lot of adjusting and readjusting and finally digging into the frozen ground with a hammer, because even with all of the tools I've accumulated over the past couple of years of attempting projects that are way above my skill level, I still don't have a regular shovel. I worked at leveling the sawhorses until I thought it was good enough. We'll never know if I was right for reasons you will see shortly. To keep everything square and make sure the two halves of the framing stayed a consistent distance apart, I cut out some spacers from 2x4s. I was thinking that I was going to be able to do this first part of assembly alone, but as soon as I started carrying the first piece of framing, I remembered that that would be impossible because I am weak and bad at this stuff. Luckily, my neighbor Dave showed up to help.
Big piece.
Yeah, he showed up just in time.
How long is that boat?
17 feet. Like that? I should have put in the bulkheads first, but I was a little nervous because I wanted Dave to be impressed by my building skills, so I sort of forgot to reference the plans and or use common sense, and I just started going to town with the spacers. This combined with the fact that I, for some reason, started to put the first spacer in just a random spot right in the middle of the board, meant that we had to do more work than should have been necessary to make sure the two pieces of framing were lined up evenly.
Oh,
Should I just
measure down. Measure down from the back to that 2x4, then measure the same exact distance. Right now, pal.
This is when my other neighbor got home, took one look at my flimsy $10 sawhorses with scrap wood screwed into the top, spat in disgust, and replaced them with his much better ones. I only hope he doesn't regret this when he realizes that his sawhorses might be trapped under my amateur attempt at a boat build for months or, heaven forbid, years.
Measurements come into play. Ooh, like a glove.
The bulkhead fit the frames just as I'd hoped, hallelujah, but they were a pretty tight fit, so after struggling for a couple minutes, we went off script and flipped the hull over to sit right side up, so we could try to knock the bulkheads down into place rather than trying to force them up.
How far is it?
It took some muscle and some time, but after enough whacking, we got them snugly in place and flipped the boat back over.
Stay here. Wait until the structure.
Next step was the partial bulkheads. The first one I grabbed was also an extremely tight fit and took a lot of persuading and some trimming to finally fit into place. I glued it with some epoxy, but with a high temperature of 32 degrees that day and an epoxy that's supposed to cure at 77, I decided to hold off on gluing the remaining 5 until I could be sure that the first one would set up properly. This decision was motivated purely by an effort to be responsible and do things right, and not at all influenced by the fact that I was beginning to feel more motivated to go sit in my house and eat snacks than continue to work on the boat. I filled my tummy and warmed my feet and got back at it. That was so wild to see what was this morning just a pile of flat pieces of plywood in my garage turn into something that looks kind of like a boat in like an hour, 2 hours maybe. I don't know what I was expecting, but it's very motivating. Now that I actually have room to move around in my garage again, I'm gonna start working on cutting out a couple more of the pieces that I need, and then I'm probably gonna call that good for today because I want to make sure that my glue sets up out there in the cold before I start gluing everything. These bow and stern panels are the first pieces of the hull that will actually be visible when the boat is done. The rest have just been internal framing. These will be the front and back of the outside of the finished hull. I had a bit of renewed motivation because, as weird as it seems, the hull coming together was just as sudden and exciting to me as it might seem to you guys. You'd think that maybe I should have known how it was going to come together, and I did in theory, but it was all kind of abstract until I actually saw it happen, and it happened so fast. One minute, I was a girl who liked to cut out bits of plywood in her garage for fun most days, and the next, I was a girl who had a boat in my backyard. With all the space that the first bit of assembly cleared up, it was much easier to get to work on these panels. Both came from one sheet of plywood. Shout out to Roy for making these plans so easy and efficient, and just another reminder that all of you could be building this cute little houseboat along with me. If I manage to pull this off, that will be undeniable proof that truly anyone can do this. So if you're thinking about it, go to roydesignthat.com and get yourself some plans. This is not sponsored. The bow and stern panels both have angles on the top and bottom, so I cut off as little material as I could manage and then flipped the piece around to cut a parallel angle on the other side. I cut off the corners to match the shape of the hull, and the stern panel was ready to go. The bow panel was a little more tricky because I had cut it to size without thinking about the angles, and I wasn't sure the piece would actually be big enough to get the angles that I needed. So I tried to cut off as little as possible on the top edge, but the bottom edge was a struggle. I think maybe because the heavy side of the saw was just dangling over air on this cut. This was so frustrating, and I ended up with pretty poor results, but luckily I needed to cut the corners off, which would eliminate much of the bad job I'd done on the bottom cut, except then I also really struggled with the very last cut. My battery was dying and I was fighting with it because I was about a 6-inch cut away from being done for the day. I learned my lesson maybe when I finally changed the battery, and the rest of the cut took like 5 seconds and went perfectly. I ended up with a piece that looked like this. Yikes. Yikes indeed. After I cleaned it up with my sander, it looked more like this, but even so, I ended up with this sort of double angle. I gotta say, I've been getting pretty sick of cutting out all these nearly identical little pieces. It's been a struggle to convince myself to get out here and work lately, but putting together those couple pieces of the hull earlier has really renewed my motivation. I would even go so far as to say I'm kind of excited to get out here and start working tomorrow. Since the plan was to install this piece pretty much immediately, I decided to just try it out and see if it seemed like something that could be safely fudged a little bit, but I've emotionally prepared myself for the possibility that I'll have to scrap this whole bow panel and start over. It's starting to feel like going out to check my epoxy is just part of my regular morning routine these days. The temperatures hadn't gotten above freezing any time in the last 24 hours, but it seems like this epoxy is just a lot more forgiving than the stuff I used to pour my countertops last year. Looks fine. You know what that means. It meant that it was time to get ready and get moving. This was the last clear day before we were supposed to have a stretch of pretty serious snowstorms and super cold temperatures, and I was determined to have something satisfying to show for myself by the time the storms blew in. I measured and marked the locations for the remaining 5 partial bulkheads to make my life easier once I was working with the glue. I measured where the backside should go and then used this scrap of 2x2 to mark the front. The piece I installed the day before was a real get into place, so I wanted to make sure the other 5 were actually going to fit before I mixed the epoxy, since I was working by myself this time. A couple of them needed tapping and some just slid right in, but none of them were nearly as difficult as the first. I don't know what that says about the consistency of my building up to this point, but as usual, I'm just gonna wait and see and hope for the best. Once I was confident in the fit, I mixed the epoxy, glued the first bulkhead, and screwed it into place from the inside. At this point, I was almost wishing these bulkheads were a bit more difficult to fit, because then I wouldn't have to try to hold it in place on one side while putting a screw in the other, but I managed. My neighbor showed up again and helped me with the last couple of bulkheads. I know a lot of you think that I should be hiring a professional boat builder to help me with this, and that's simply never gonna happen, but rest assured I lucked out with neighbors who are always happy to wander over and set me straight whenever I'm doing something stupid. After all 6 bulkheads were in place, it was time to move on to the bow and stern panels that I cut the day before. I thought that I was being so slick by putting this plywood guide on so I could do this by myself. I screwed it in and then realized I'd put it in the totally wrong spot, so I moved it and then I started to get the panel into place. I measured the center of the panel and did the same thing on the temporary spacer in the frame. Luckily there's a tarp right there because there is a 0% chance that I would have made the effort to go get it otherwise, so I laid down, matched up the center lines on the spacer and the panel, threw in a couple of screws to hold it in place, and then measured both sides to verify that I'd placed it correctly. Okay. Both of my measurements came out the same, and I couldn't think of another way to double check myself, but I did realize that I could hold a little piece of plywood up against the plywood in the frame to make sure that the panel was lined up with that, which watching back is very obviously the same thing I'd already done with the top, but you guys, I'm not sure I think through such things very well under the best of circumstances, and definitely not when I'm stressed because I'm doing something that could make or break whether my boat's actually gonna float or not. Despite all of my measuring and slick ideas, I was not brave enough to glue the panel in place yet, so I moved on. I decided to use the same method for the stern panel because the bow went so smoothly. And if you think I'm being sarcastic, you are wrong. That bow panel installation was about as smooth as these things ever go when I'm in charge. So I placed the guide, then measured the halfway point on the bottom spacer, spent an embarrassing amount of time trying to peek my head around the framing to make sure the angles lined up before I realized I could just scooch the plywood over with me. And has anyone noticed the huge and obvious mistake I'm about to make yet? I marked the center of the plywood, put it in place, was trying to hold it there with my knee, and you should see the bruise that left me with. And then I was having a heck of a time trying to move it like a millimeter to the left while also supporting the entire weight. I finally got it perfect, screwed it into place, and stepped back to admire the spoils of my perfectionism, only to realize that I'd put it in upside down.
Are you kidding me?
At this point, I realized that I should work smarter and put the guide on the bottom instead of the top so it could double as a shelf and I wouldn't have to support the weight of the plywood while also trying to finesse it into place. Again, I know that seems so obvious to anyone watching, including me editing, but I don't know, at least I got there eventually. I had to move the spacer to make the shelf thing fit in place and a screw got stuck. This is a really good example of something that should be simple and fast, but there's just no telling how many dumb little issues are gonna slow me down sometimes. I got the spacer out but couldn't get the screw out of the plywood, so I decided to just leave that as a nice little treat for future Emma to rip her clothes on next week. When I got the guide/shelf into place on the bottom, I removed the top guide, which is what had my center mark. I put the plywood onto the shelf, then I realized that I'd lost my center mark, so I spent a minute debating with myself about what would be the easiest way to get it back. Do I try to put the top guide back exactly where it was? No, I'm sure to F that up and not notice. Do I make a mark on the bottom of the other side? I tried to take a shortcut and just scooch the panel back and forth until the measurements on both sides came out equal, but quickly realized that would be way more work than just remarking the bottom spacer. So I made a center mark on the bottom, marked the bottom of the plywood on the correct side, lowered it back into place, put a couple screws in, removed the bottom guide, and then adjusted it to line up exactly with the plywood on top. You know, trying to keep things simple. In summary, I did the exact opposite of what I did on the front. After I moved it around to try to get it just right, I double checked to make sure all of the measurements were the same on either side, and they were not.
I don't think that is quite right, honestly. I don't know how it got off, but
maybe because I took all that time and went to all those lengths to make sure it was right and then moved it?
I need to just stop drilling new holes right now. I'm too nervous to glue either of those pieces until a second pair of eyes confirms that it's okay to do. I just really want to get this big stuff right, you know? I may or may not work for a couple more hours today. It'll be nothing exciting if so. The wind is picking up and I think the weekend of storms is about to arrive, so I might just call it here. Again, I am so surprised by what happened in the last like 30 hours. I have like a whole boat now. Just really hope that I don't get on here next video and tell you guys that it was all wrong and I had to undo it. Next time I may be building a little bit more permanent of a structure for the boat to live in. May have help of somebody who's a lot cooler and better builder than me. So let's hope so anyway.
You should know.